cannot be. The solutions for these problems cannot be found in a small national context. Our times call for a strong international cooperation. And my country, Germany, is committed to this international cooperation. Worldwide, cities are growing bigger and bigger. More housing is needed, resulting in an increasing number of even larger and higher constructions. It is not new to us that big cities are one of the key players when it comes to carbon emissions. And it might come as a surprise to some. Energy use in buildings in Europe and the US accounts for approximately 40% of citywide greenhouse emissions. Therefore, municipalities, regional governments, and national leaders are trying to find incentives in order to increase the number of energy-efficient buildings. While there is no one-size-fits-all solution to this problem, due to regional differences and varying legislative backgrounds, it is worth to look what we can learn from each other, be it our immediate neighbors or partners on the other side of the Atlantic. And this is why events like today's are so important. And I would like to thank Danielle Spiegelfeld, who has been the heart of the event series Transatlantic Dialogue, focusing on issues like climate change, sustainability, and most recently, carbon curbing of cars. It is finally my pleasure to welcome our three speakers. And since we have an online event, we are even able to combine speakers from both sides of the Atlantic. Welcome to New York and also to Berlin. I'm sure that all three experts will provide us with an enlightening discussion. Enjoy.
Shall I start?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't get that. Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Counselor. Thank you very much, Danielle, for this event. I will share some insights on the German carbon pricing system, and I will share my screen. So you should see the full screen mode now. Just a second. Okay. So yeah, I will talk a little bit about the German situation on implementing carbon pricing for the building sector. But I'd like to start with an overview. So why do we actually have to put a price on carbon? I will also give you some background on the debate about carbon pricing in Germany, because I think it's important to understand why this happened. And then, of course, finally, I'll introduce to you the German case of carbon pricing. So first of all, I think this figure is very important to understand why a price on carbon is important. This shows you, it's the key iconic figure, I would say, of climate change. And what can you see here is that in the 70s, people said, well, we are running out of fossil fuels. But quite the contrary is the case. So we still have abundant fossil fuels in the ground, 15,000 gigatons of CO2, mainly coal, but also oil and gas. But on the other hand, if we want to limit temperature increase to less than 2 degrees, we may not emit more than 800 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere. So what you see here is that we have quite the controversy or the converted situation that the disposal space of the atmosphere is limited, but there are still plenty of resources, fossil fuel resources stored underground. So, and what do economists do when they have a scarce resource? They put a price on it. So therefore, this is the main reason for putting a price on carbon, because we have to deal with these limited disposal space. So you could say, well, okay, that's just a fancy economist's idea, but it also works in practice. So carbon pricing has been now installed in many countries, in many municipalities or cities as well, as you discussed. So more than 50 countries and regions. And you see on the left-hand side here, this is a figure by the World Bank. You see very different schemes of emission trading or carbon taxes implemented. So quite a nice, colorful map over the whole world. Also, China is considering carbon pricing. On the right-hand side, I put here two examples because I find it interesting that they already started. Sweden and Switzerland quite early, so in Sweden 1990, in Switzerland 2008, also with the carbon price in the building sector. And emissions have been reduced in the building sector and here also in the transport sector. These are examples, and also on a very empirical basis, some colleagues from Australia, they have analyzed the different trading schemes or carbon pricing schemes that have been in place since 2007, and they really experienced that carbon dioxide emissions fell in these times, whereas in countries where they didn't have a carbon price increased. So this is the background why to put a price on carbon and why this is a very important policy instrument. Now I will start with a debate about carbon pricing in Germany, a little bit of the background. And I think there were three important issues in 2018-19 that led also to this decision. So first of all, we had a very hot summer in 2018. And people experienced, okay, climate change is real. So also my neighbors, normally not very interested in what I work, as they said, oh yeah, what you're doing is important because climate change is real. And I mean, we also follow with great sadness currently what's happening in California with the fires. So also in the US, I think people experience that climate change is real. Then also important, we had a very powerful Fridays for Future movement. So you all know Greta Thunberg from Sweden, but also in Germany, there was a kind of, yeah, or still is a kind of iconic figure, Luisa Neubauer, and with a strong movement behind it. And what I found very interesting is this figure shows you, it says CO2 tax now. And I think it's very impressive for a youth movement to call for a carbon tax. And actually they called for a carbon tax of 180 euro. That was also very important. So this was the first two issues, perhaps a little bit behind the scenes, you could say, or the political spirit. But there was actually also a kind of economic driver to put a price on carbon, because to give you the background, what's happening at the European level. So Germany has binding targets for the years between 2021 and 2030, yearly budgets, CO2 budgets for the heating and transport and agriculture sector. And if Germany doesn't fulfill these targets, we have to pay money to Brussels, to the European Commission, in brief, so to say. And so policymakers calculated this, and especially also the Ministry of Finance, and they said, okay, when we have to pay a 100 euro per ton fee, then rather let's start and do something in Germany. And you can see here the deviation, what is expected and what has to be delivered by EU regulation. And all these three things came together, I think, that were all very important boundary conditions. I will give you also one slide for the institutional background, because this is also perhaps important to understand. So at the European level, we already have an emission trading system. It covers 45% of the emissions, and it covers the full power sector and parts of the industry. So this is already covered by a carbon price, but the problem was in Germany to meet the targets here in the so-called non-ETS, or mainly the transport and building sector. So, and this part is not covered by a carbon price. And this was where the debate centered on. So what was now happening in Germany, a big political debate, and actually we were asked by the Chancellor's office via some corners to provide an expertise on how to implement carbon pricing in the German system. And it was very difficult because we had a kind of tension between the coalition that is in place in Germany. So the Christian Democrats, they favored an emission trading system, and the Social Democrats favored a tax system, and it was a bit back and forth and difficult. And what we did with our scientific expertise, we put on the table options. We didn't go for one option, but we said there are different options to put a price on carbon. And these are, in principle, the two main options. Of course, you can either go for a carbon tax or you can go for an emission trading system. And in the end, or according to textbook economics, the outcome is the same. But in practical reality, there are some important things to consider. So if you go for a price path, in order to meet the same target or to meet the exact target, you have to be able to adapt from time to time to make adjustments to your price path. And the question from us to the policymakers was, do you feel being able to adapt the path from time to time, or is this too difficult on a yearly basis because you always have to find a new consensus and so on? So this was that part with the carbon price path. And on the other hand, implementing an emission trading system has two difficulties. And we experienced this in the European emission trading system. There might be a situation when the price is very low for a long time, and you have then a kind of hockey stick curve, so low level of the price and then strongly increasing price. That's difficult for the economy, that's difficult for companies who want to invest if you do not have a kind of steady expectation. So therefore we said it would be important to have a minimum price, to implement a minimum price as well, to say, to give investors a kind of security how the prices develop. And on the other hand, if you let the emission trading system, let's say, freely floating or freely work, there might be also the difficulty that you get too high prices. And actually, we didn't have any experience with which prices are needed in the building sector to reach the targets. So we said, okay, if you do that, you might also need to implement an upper level in order to secure that the prices do not get too high. So the numbers that are given are for the German situation, very specific, but just to give you the overall picture here. Okay, so what happened? Big debates in Germany over last summer, and what came out is the following. It's for comparison, this is the price path here, the blue line that we put on the table in our expertise. And what came out, it's called an emission trading system, but if you have a look at it, you see, well, it looks more like a tax, but it must not be called a tax, right? That's for, it has some legal reasons why this is not allowed to call a tax. So therefore it's called a fixed price. So we start, or in Germany, we implement an emission trading system, but we start with a fixed price in 2021, and then going over to an emission trading system with a minimum and maximum price. So this is the red dotted line here that you can see. And the problem was that actually, or the first decision in September last year was they wanted to start with a very low price of 10 euros. And that was not very well received. There were heavy protests, as I said before, a strong Fridays for Future movement. More than 1.4 million people were on the street, and they protested against this very low level of ambition. 10 euros is really not very much. And actually, then there was a decision taken to upgrade this in December. So starting with 25 euros, and this is now the decision we have. And what I want to point out is the decision was taken in December, but it was put into law in May. And in May this year, we already had the Corona crisis. So I think it was a strong commitment to say, okay, we go for the higher price level, even if we have a Corona, because we cannot play out the one crisis with the other. So therefore, sorry, this is now the price we have. It's called an emission trading system, starting with a fixed price, then having a price band after 2025. And here you see it's still open until 2030. There might be a European perspective. It's still discussed. It's still open what happens here. Then some technical detail. You could say who is regulated. It's an upstream system. What does it mean? It means that not the end users are regulated, but rather really at the upper level, importers of heating oils and fuels, wholesalers, refineries. So it includes for transport and heating about 4,000 companies. And it also generates revenues. That's also interesting for the finance ministry, for example, in the order of magnitude of about 10 billion per year in the first 3 years. And we also had a big debate about the use of revenues. About 60% will be used for green spending and about 40% for direct relief measures for households and firms. Yeah, so to summarize, the first point is, I think most of you will agree with me that we are still a long way from achieving the Paris objectives. And I think we lack measures to underpin the targets that we have, because without policy instruments, targets are more like toothless tigers. In my opinion, carbon pricing should become the leading instrument of climate policy. I explained in the very beginning why this is this oversupply of fossil fuels still in the ground. We have to manage the scarcity in the atmosphere. And you could also say that the price level is a kind of indicator for the seriousness of climate policy. And then the lessons from the German case, I would say it's probably not the easiest system to explain and to understand. And when we showed it to our neighbors in the Netherlands, for example, they said, well, I do not understand. This is not an emission trading system. It has very particularities to the German case. So therefore, the architecture is driven by specific political constraints and perhaps preferences. But nonetheless, it's an architecture where we can, it's a first step. We can learn a lot from the experiences that we will gain, and perhaps we will also make it better over time. But I think it's an important step to start carbon pricing and have this kind of architecture in place now. Thank you very much.
Should I get started?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
Let's go ahead and we'll turn over to Nicole and Austen.
Thank you. I'm going to quickly share my screen. Okay. So my name is Nicole Abene, and I am here with my colleague, Austen Brandford, and we are both legislative attorneys working with the New York City Council. And we worked to draft, negotiate, and ultimately pass Local Law 97 of 2019. And we're here today to talk about that and about the potential for carbon trading in buildings in New York City. So I will begin with a summary of Local Law 97 of 2019, sort of just a brief overview. So if there are specific questions about the law, we're happy to answer those at the end. And then Austen will discuss the carbon trading study that's legislated in Local Law 97 and how that might interact with the law. So buildings make up 3/4 of all emissions in New York City, and Local Law 97 sets limits for the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that large buildings are permitted to emit. The law also creates the Office of Energy and Emissions Performance within the Department of Buildings, and that office is responsible for implementation of Local Law 97, but also for implementation of future laws around energy use in buildings and emissions reductions in buildings. The law, importantly, also creates an advisory board, and that advisory board is full of experts and stakeholders with a wide range of expertise who provide advice and recommendations to the office and help to make sure that this law is successful in New York. So the law sets emissions limits based on the occupancy group of a building. So this means that residences will be compared to other residences, that businesses will be compared to other businesses, and hospitals to other hospitals. So for the first compliance date, beginning in 2024, the limits were set to mandate a reduction of emissions from the highest emitting 20% of buildings in each occupancy group. So that means that if you are one of the highest emitting 20% of buildings, you have to lower your emissions to be at the same level of the lowest emitting 80% of buildings. And then for the second compliance date, beginning in 2030, the limits were set to mandate a reduction of emissions from the highest emitting 75% of buildings in each occupancy group. This is, of course, only a broad outline of the mandate here, and there are some different compliance paths available. I'm not going to go through all of those details right now. But there are, so we do understand that complying with the law will be easier for some buildings than others, right? Depending on your current emissions profile, depending on what your building does, and depending on the actual building itself. And so there are some adjustments available. The law was drafted to be ambitious, but ultimately, hopefully very achievable. We want to see these emissions reductions made. We want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the city of New York. And so there are some adjustments to get emissions reductions that aren't quite to the level stated in the bill, but will still reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Some examples of this are if there is a building that cannot make the retrofits due to a landmark designation, but that building makes an effort to purchase offsets and they're unable to make the actual retrofits necessary because of the way that their building is built. There could be an adjustment available. It's also true if there are severe financial limitations to a building and they've made every effort to make emissions reductions. There are some adjustments to the limits set on the law that could be available. It's also true if a building has emissions that are much higher than the stated limits, 40% over the greenhouse gas emissions limits. They submit a plan to get under the limits for the next compliance date, and there could be an adjustment available for that building as well. As you can imagine, based on the topic of today's conversation, there could also be another compliance path that could be helpful. And so now I'll turn it over to Austen to talk a little bit about the potential for carbon trading and how that fits in with Local Law 97.
Sure. Thanks so much, Nicole. So tying this back to carbon trading, Local Law 97 also mandated a study of carbon trading and a carbon trading implementation plan, both of which are due on January 1st of 2021, so just a few more months from now. The first question here is why did we choose to require a study of carbon trading instead of just baking it into the local law at the outset? And there's a few reasons here. First, we understood that carbon trading would be complicated, as we're learning more about today, and we knew it would be very difficult to be actually implemented. But we wanted to make sure that it would be an option down the line. So we created some time to allow stakeholders to get together and help to teach us the best way to pursue this while ultimately lowering greenhouse gas emissions citywide. Second reason is because we wanted to make sure that a carbon trading system was done really well and that it kept in mind environmental justice communities, which we do not want to leave behind. We knew this would take time to iron out really well and to get all the advocates in a room together to discuss how it would work best. So the study lets us do that. Third, we wanted to enact the emissions limits that the local law includes quickly to tip off covered buildings about these upcoming compliance dates so they can kind of get on their path to compliance. And if we were to bake in a carbon trading regime early on, it may have delayed the bill at the outset, and that we didn't want that either. Next slide. So where the study stands today, the study is being conducted by a group of experts with a really wide variety of backgrounds. There's lawyers, economists, sustainability experts, building owner representatives, and more. The first phase of the study was focused on discovery. So things like literature review, data gathering, and analyzing the legal authority to actually establish a carbon trading program in the city, kind of the scope setting questions of the study. The second phase, which is the current phase, has shifted to some modeling and scenario testing. So in this phase, the group is analyzing how Local Law 97 will operate as it exists today without carbon trading. So gathering information about the buildings implicated and how compliance will ultimately manifest, and what the costs are and what the potential emissions reductions are there. Next, they're also currently looking at how compliance and associated costs will be affected by implementing certain carbon trading scenarios, ultimately to determine which one is the best scenario to move forward with. In the next step, which is analyzing the results of different scenario tests, then developing recommendations and working through an actual implementation plan to make this a reality one day. Next slide. So what's next for carbon trading in New York? We're looking forward to seeing the results of the study and understanding how the City Council can be helpful moving this forward. Related, the study will help us to answer a lot of questions about the actual administration of the program. As we understand, it will be very, very complex. In the meantime, we're going to keep learning about how a carbon trading system could affect environmental justice communities, and having the ultimate goal of ensuring that such a system provides substantial benefits to all parts of the city and not just a few. And that's it for us.
Great. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Dr. Knopf and Nicole and Austen for some informative and engaging presentations to sort of tee up the subject for us. It's really interesting to compare and contrast the approaches in different jurisdictions. So carbon trading is not a new policy idea. There are a number of carbon trading systems that have been operating for years now. But carbon trading in the building sector for buildings is relatively new policy territory. So I want to take us back to the rationale. We heard a little bit about the sort of overarching climate rationale and the need for action now, but zeroing in a little more specifically on the trading piece and the building sector. Why do we need carbon trading for the building sector? What are the key benefits of this approach or potential approach? And how can it help us achieve our climate goals? And I'll pose that to all three of you.
So I'm happy to start from our perspective. I think, we drafted Local Law 97 to study carbon trading, and so I'm not sure that I'm ready to answer that specifically, but I do think that we want to get the most emissions reductions in buildings where it's simplest to get those emissions reductions. And so if there are some buildings in New York City that could be well below our limits, it makes sense to incentivize them to reduce their emissions. And a way to do that is being able to sell off that credit. And I think there's always going to be some buildings that have trouble with retrofits, that have trouble reducing their emissions. And so the idea that we can get the most benefit where it's available is very attractive. And the policy goal here, I mean, buildings are such a huge part of our emissions profile that if implementing a carbon trading study reduces the actual emissions, I think it could only help with the implementation of the law.
Thank you, Nicole. Austen or Dr. Knopf, would you like to weigh in on that question?
I think Nicole covered it for our end.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm also happy I can just repeat what I said before. So I think it's important to put a price on carbon to have a very powerful instrument, and we can really show or have the experience that it works, right? There might be, we might need additional instruments or whatever, but carbon pricing is the kind of basics, and that's important to implement. And then you can build on other instruments as well. But if you do not have the basics clear, it's like modern medicine without penicillin, so you cannot do it.
Okay. So one of the differences in the overall regulatory approach that I think jumps out to me is the sort of upstream versus downstream idea. So as we heard in the German system, there's an upstream approach, meaning the regulatory touch, who is regulated, are entities that are further up the chain. It's those that are selling or importing or distributing fuels, heating fuels or gasoline or otherwise. And I think Dr. Knopf mentioned there's about 4,000 companies, and that includes transportation and building sector. By contrast, New York City has taken a downstream regulatory approach focused on regulating energy use and carbon in individual buildings. So I'd like to hear from Dr. Knopf about why Germany has taken an upstream approach in the building sector, what the rationale behind that is, and then from Nicole and Austen, why New York City is focusing on the downstream and what are the implications of that approach as we think through a possible carbon trading system.
Yeah, I would say a big difference between the approaches or the systems is one is a country and the other one is a city, right? And you have different control levels. I mean, in Germany, I showed you the point of regulation. It's the same point where the energy tax is being taken. So actually you already have a kind of setup, you have regulating rules, you have reporting rules and so on. You do not have to set up an additional system. So therefore it was a kind of straightforward way, you could say. And perhaps in New York, perhaps you cannot go to the upstream level because you do not have the control over that, right? So therefore, naturally, some different approaches occur. And actually, a downstream system wasn't debated in Germany at all. And I mean, if we look at the building structure in New York, it's probably different from having little villages, for example, in the housing sector that should be included in the trading. So therefore, in Germany, we went for that approach because we already had the point of regulation. It wasn't a new finding or a new institution, but already setting up on an existing system.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I think that's a really important point, right? We work for New York City, so we work within like the parameters of being a city, and the council members have been able to create some really incredible progressive policy within those limitations. And so we took the approach that we did because it was the opportunity that we had. And hopefully we can work in tandem with the state and the federal government's energy goals, right? The New York State has some progressive clean energy goals that will hopefully affect the way Local Law 97 is implemented and the way it's complied with. And hopefully the new demand that's being created for clean energy will create new clean energy. And so, yeah, we're excited to see how the downstream approach is able to affect the creation of energy as well.
Thank you. So let's turn to the question of environmental justice that came up a bit in the presentations. So some previous trading programs have drawn criticisms that they have negatively affected low-income communities, communities of color, often called environmental justice communities. Dr. Knopf, I'm curious whether this subject was controversial or a subject of significant debate in the German context, and how Germany's program will affect low and moderate income residents, whether fuel prices will increase, for example, and if so, if the program has been or is being designed to address concerns or challenges in that sector. And then we'll come to the New York City context.
Yeah, actually, that has been the strongest debate in Germany because, I mean, we and also others called for a carbon price, and then people said, oh, well, it will just affect the poor and only the poor have to pay this. And that was a very difficult debate, but actually it was also, it shifted over time, I would say, because then proposals came up because from carbon pricing, be it tax or an emission trading system, you have revenues. And then the debate shifted to the question what to do with the revenues. And there was one proposal that was very high on the table to say to give back the revenues on a per capita basis, right? So if you pay for higher prices in the transport and building sector, at the end of the year, you get back a kind of check with 100 euros from the revenues. This is the situation in Switzerland. And actually in Germany, people were in favor of that, but we didn't have the institution that could do that, right? And also some people said, well, it's not just to give the money back, but we also have to provide alternatives, for example, in the transport sector, but also in the building sector for retrofitting. And this is now the outcome. So there are two different things to support low-income households, I would say. So on the one hand, really I would call it infrastructure issues, so support for retrofitting of housing, energy efficiency, support in housing techniques. So this is one branch, you could say, of cushioning the social problems. And the other one is to reduce some other, for example, the feed-in tariff levy, or in principle, the electricity price that the households have to pay. So the electricity price is reduced by a specific scheme. So that's a direct reduction of the electricity bill. And also, for example, people in Germany, low income, or there's a kind of support for low income households for living, and this is being increased. So there are two ways of dealing with this, you could say, well, social imbalance or social problems, but it was a hot topic. And I think, yeah, now there are different measures on the table to really address that question. I think it's important.
And just to clarify, did the revenue investment for retrofit programs and the electricity reimbursement or subsidies, are those applicable across the board or focused specifically on certain demographics or geographies?
They are applicable for all, but for low-income houses, for low-income households, there are specific programs because support for living is just given to people with low income. So therefore, there are specific measures. I think there is another measure that just tackles the really low-income households. For the others, it's for everybody, but as it is per capita, those with a lower income profit more, right? So because if you get 100 euros with a lower income, the proportion is higher than for richer households. So therefore, we have analyzed this in detail and can really see that the lowest income group is it's better off than the rest, relatively. So, yeah.
Gotcha. Let's turn to the New York City context, where I know this has been a very important subject. So maybe Austen, to you in particular, I know you've participated in some stakeholder engagement on the carbon trading policy development. And Nicole, if you want to jump in on the Local Law 97 pieces, please do, of course. So I guess first, maybe we can drill down a little on how Local Law 97 addresses environmental justice so the audience understands that. But then also let's look at what environmental justice concerns have been raised and how they may be addressed and what role trading could potentially play in helping buildings in environmental justice communities.
Sure. So with carbon trading specifically, that's very central to the study and any subsequent carbon trading system and plan that this results in, to the extent that Local Law 97 actually requires that study, that considering the implications for these communities is a part of the study process. That said, we still know there are some advocates who are concerned that a market-based path to compliance will have some negative impacts like pollution hotspots or just overlook these communities entirely. But the hope is that this study can set up a system that reduces emissions from buildings and also works with these communities to ensure they're part of the process and the goals of reducing emissions citywide. In a perfect world, this system could work to actually prioritize these communities and bring in funds and service providers to assist with upgrading buildings and lowering pollution in the areas. But we'll need the study and some of the results and the expert input to hopefully get it there.
Great, thanks. Nicole, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so if the question is about like how stakeholders were included in this process, I think it was very extensive, as you know. So during the process of drafting and negotiating Local Law 97, I mean, UGC ran a whole working group around this that we participated in. We talked to experts and stakeholders across, I would say, most industries that this bill will affect. And the same is true now through the advisory board that Local Law 97 mandated, that's currently doing the work to make sure this bill is implemented well and can be implemented in other cities across the country. And it's true in the carbon trading study, right? There's a group of stakeholders who are involved in that as well, so that we can get input. And a big part of it is to make sure that it works for New York City, right? And New York City is incredibly diverse, and we have a lot of EJ communities, and we want to make sure that while we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we're working with communities and making sure that communities are being heard.
Great, thank you. Let's turn to the question of price. I've seen a couple questions from the audience already on this, but price is always a crucial concern in any market-based trading program. Dr. Knopf, I'd love to hear how the price was set in the German context. And I know you mentioned the adjustment to that very soon after. And then Nicole and Austen, in the New York City context, we of course don't have a specific price on carbon yet. There's no commodity, there's no trading program yet. We're still in the evaluation phase. But there is a penalty in Local Law 97 that does kind of come at that in a roundabout way. So maybe you can speak to that, where that penalty came from, and how it might ultimately relate to a carbon price.
Yeah, so there were also questions in the chat about price level and how did it come with these 25 euros. Actually, for researchers, it's a bit sad, I would say, because we made a thorough analysis which kind of price level would be needed. And I've seen that in your New York approach, you also make scenarios, and I think this is very important to get an impression of which kind of price level is needed or how does it work. But actually then, I think in the end, it was a political negotiation and it took place within one night. And it was really like giving pledges, right? One of the parties came and they said, we would like to have 35 euro as a starting price. And then others said, no, this is nothing we can afford. We cannot pay our voters. It's too hard for commuters. And we just want to have a 10 euro price. And what I know for sure, I mean, this is real what I said. So there are some, yeah, this was reported from these nights. And what I know that they also considered of just starting in 2022 with a higher price of 20 euros. And I think the debate wouldn't have been so strong, but the signal to give just 10 euros, that was so strong, it was so negatively connotated, and people took it up and said, okay, they do not take climate change seriously, they do not go for an ambitious climate policy, and therefore the protests began. And you probably know that we have the parliament and the second chamber where the so-called Bundesländer, so the Länder are in there. And because this law had to pass the second chamber as well, where the Green Party is very strong, then there was an increase in the price. But it was really part of political negotiations, and I would say not so much based on scientific knowledge or different studies competing on that.
Great. Let's turn to the New York City context and the penalty and get a little background there. Just before we do, I want to encourage all of you to put some questions into the Q&A, because we're going to turn to audience Q&A right after this.
Yeah, so we don't actually have a carbon tax price, but there is built into the legislation a penalty for noncompliance. Of course, right, we want people to comply with the law. That's the goal of legislation, not to have people pay penalties. And there is a lot built into the law to be flexible so that buildings can comply. And the mandate is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but the penalties were calculated to be comparable to what we expected an average building to pay for retrofits to reduce their emissions would be, so that we didn't have people making the choice to pay penalties rather than make the changes to their building or whatever other updates or offsets or recs would be purchased. So I'm sure that if and when the carbon trading study is done and the plan is implemented, that price will likely influence what you can, will influence the way that that market works. I believe it's something like $268 per square foot. But it's based on how much your emissions are over the emissions limit. And it's in order to incentivize people to really make the changes to really reduce the carbon.
Great, thanks, Nicole. Yeah, so just for comparison, the price is, as Nicole said, it's $268 per metric ton over a carbon cap. And to be clear, it's free emissions up to that point. So it's a very different approach, and we'll see sort of how that plays out and how trading can fit into it. So let's turn to some audience Q&A. The first question we have here is for Dr. Knopf, and it's, how does the density of a built environment affect the viability of a trading program? Do you need a minimum density to develop a robust market? And I think covering a national level program, you have dense urban cities, but then also, as you alluded to earlier, rural villages with the opposite of density. Does that factor into the development of the market in that context?
Actually, perhaps I didn't fully get the question, but I think because we have an upstream system, I do know the connection, how this should influence density or what density has to do with this. Perhaps I didn't get the question. Perhaps Nicole can answer that.
I think maybe that's right, that the question is likely coming from the New York City context and thinking about the number of buildings that would be individually engaging in a trading program, and that would vary quite a bit between urban and rural. But to your point, in the German context, it's not the buildings that are subject to the allowance purchase and therefore to be trading anything once trading becomes part of the program. It's the sellers, the importers, the distributors. So, so I guess what you're saying then is that that wouldn't have an impact because those entities aren't operating in the city or the village, they're operating at a level that is above that. Okay, great. Our next question is in the New York City context. Council's recently proposed to increase the number of buildings with affordable housing that are subject to Local Law 97. How does Council envision these buildings participating in a trading scheme, and how will they pay for improvements, potentially from fines, but those go to a general fund? So perhaps Austen or Nicole, you could explain the treatment of buildings with some affordable housing units that's being referred to here and the amendment that's currently before the council.
Sure. So I think what this question is alluding to is that in Local Law 97, there is a special compliance path for rent regulated accommodations. And we define those by buildings that have at least one rent regulated unit. And this is in an effort to make sure that low-income tenants aren't being subject to major capital improvement increases in their rent because of a mandate that the building reduce their emissions and therefore make retrofits. And those laws, the major capital improvement laws, are state laws. And so the MCI laws, the state law for rent regulated accommodations, just changed recently. And so there's an introduction in the city council to amend the definition of rent-regulated accommodations in Local Law 97 to match that state definition. And that would change it from buildings with one or more rent-regulated accommodations to buildings with 35% or more. And so it would include more buildings in the definition of buildings that have to comply with the emissions limits in Local Law 97. And so this question is, how would these buildings then participate in a trading scheme? I think the answer to that is really going to be answered in a carbon trading study. And unfortunately, we don't have all the answers about how exactly that would work yet. But what I do know is that if that bill passed, those buildings would then have to comply with the emission limits set out in law. And then if a carbon trading study was in place, they would participate as other large residential buildings have to participate. I know that was a lot of information, so if that didn't make sense, I'm happy to explain.
No, I think that makes sense. That if the law passed, this amendment passes, they would be swept into the same position as all other buildings subject to carbon caps. And if there's a trading structure, that they would fit in as other buildings would. Checking to see whether we have other audience Q&As. Again, please put your questions into the Q&A box. And let's take one here on the sort of jurisdiction regulatory level question. We have an audience question that's, how does this trading scheme work with the state level goals and state level laws, the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act, and the difference in approaches at the state level? So I guess the question is that being incorporated into the trading study? Where does that interface work between the city and state level? And then maybe for Dr. Knopf, let's expand that to the national and supranational level. What do you foresee in the future for the German trading program and the EU ETS and potential linkages there?
Yeah, so I don't think we have the answer to how New York City trading program would fit into a CLCPA. I think that the goals of Local Law 97 and the CLCPA have been aligned and been able to work together. And I'm hopeful that even with after the carbon trading study is completed, that they'll be able to work together still. But we're still deep in the study stage of this.
Great. And I can add to that I believe the analysis will be considering the way the grid evolves over time and how that affects the building stock. So to the extent that the state level laws are about driving green energy into the downstate grid, that's certainly going to be factored into how a trading market might play out. How about in the German context, Dr. Knopf?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question how this relates to the European level, and this is actually very high in the debate, because at the EU level we are currently discussing of increasing the targets that we already have for 2030. There's a big debate. Tomorrow the Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen will probably propose a new target into the game, and I've seen a version where it's debated to put at the European scale the transport and the building sector into the existing European emission trading system. So already at the European scale. And I think for Germany, perhaps it's not too bad to start currently with the system we have, and then over time to put it in the European perspective, because in Europe it takes a long time to take decisions and so on. We won't see it before 2025 or whatever, but then already starting at the German level and then gaining experience and then having the European perspective as well. I think that's definitely the next step.
Great. Let's take one more question. We're almost at time here, but we have a question in the German context in particular. Is there a desire to promote electrification of buildings? And is the fixed price seen as a way of promoting electrification of buildings? This is a hot topic in New York City, certainly factoring into the discussions here. How does that tie in with, how does electrification tie in with the fixed price approach?
difficult question. I would say electrification in Germany is not discussed for the building sector because it's or no, that's not right. So with the new heat exchanger, what are they called?
Heat pumps.
Heat pumps, yeah, thank you. With the new heat pumps, we will probably see an electrification in the buildings. That's right. So many new buildings are done with that one. Yeah, good question. How this will develop? Probably we will see an electrification also of the building sector. I'm pretty sure that we will see an electrification of also the transport sector. So therefore, it's again also in Germany the debate how to build up renewables. This is then the direction we have currently the debate to increase renewables or how to build new wind parks and so on. And the electrification of buildings will probably put another effort or put another burden on the electrification question.
Okay, I think we're at time, so we'll have to conclude, but I want to thank all of you, Austen, Nicole, and Dr. Knopf for your time today, for some engaging presentations. Danielle, do you want to chime in with the concluding notes?
Yeah, thank you all so much. That was really terrifically enlightening. And thank you again to the German Consul General for all of your support and partnership over the years in bringing these very fruitful dialogues to light. I would also just like to mention for all of you who participated, first, thank you for your questions and helping to contribute to a very engaging discussion. Picking up on this point about electrification, I should also flag that we'll be having an event next week, a webinar as part of Climate Week, specifically on decarbonizing the downstate grid, a look at some major new projects coming down the pipeline to help to reduce the carbon intensity of electricity that feeds into the New York City area. So I hope you'll join us for that as well. With that, I will close, let you all go back to your days, and thank you again to all of our panelists and to the German Consulate for their support of this program. Have a great day. Bye.